All right. Okay. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Zeke Lunder. Zeke Lunder is a pyrogeographer. He's been mapping fire behavior, fire incidents for decades now. He's co-founder of Deer Creek Resources, also known as Deer Creek GIS. And he and his wife started the blog site, The Lookout. It's also really wonderful. And Zeke, as I mentioned, is going to talk about how data plays a role in during a fire incident. So his talk is entitled 5 Things You'll Wish You Had Done Before Your Land Caught Fire. And after Zeke's talk, we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A. So while Zeke's talking, I highly recommend you jot down your questions, and then we'll do that. So Zeke, without further ado, I'd love to hand it over to you. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
All right. Welcome to The Lookout. Glad to have you all here. Just a quick show of hands. How many of you manage a piece of land that has a fire management plan that's already been written? Okay, good. When was it updated? Last 5 years? Okay. Well, so I started my list of 5 things that you need to do before your land burns, and then I realized that you only really need to do one thing, and that's write a fire management plan. And then the fire management plan needs to cover those 5 things. So also, I just checked out the Pacific Veg Map PowerPoint that you saw last month, and I was thinking about it, and I thought that we shouldn't conflate our ability to map vegetation at like the 4 centimeter pixel size with our ability to do anything about vegetation management at a meaningful scale. So I just wanted to start off with that idea that I'm going to talk a lot about mapping, but that when we talk about data that you should have together before the fire, that includes phone numbers and home phone numbers and knowing who's on duty at your local fire station. There's a lot of information that you need that isn't just specific to mapping data. And I want to start off just by sharing my screen here and looking at well, I've got my outline, but I want to jump to Google Earth here and share a little story from work we're doing here locally in Chico. Here's Bidwell Park, which is the best park in the whole world. It starts in downtown Chico and goes up right through town. You can swim in the creek pretty much all summer. And then it goes up into this great wild canyon and almost all the way up to Forest Ranch. And then it connects into CSU Chico reserves. And there's some great stuff happening in both in Bidwell Park and in the reserves in the foothills here with using fire for resource benefit. Well, prescribed burning at this point. So we went out last year and we mapped invasive vegetation, and we mapped, so this is all kind of gnarly. Start this on Medusa Head. And then based on that, we developed some burn units and wrote burn plans and finished that work in about May or June. And then in July, well, and then we had a chance in May to burn all this land down here. And so if you look at the Google stuff, you can see that we burned about 100 acres down here at the entrance to the park. Planning to do that every year for 3 or 4 years to try to start this one Medusa Head. Then in July, we had a fire here, and this was the park fire. And it actually extends off the photo here. And what happened there that was interesting and kind of, I think just a good illustration of kind of the limitations of planning is that these yellow units are places that we had heavy weeds, and we had established burn units, but we hadn't gotten to them. And so then we had a wildfire here that started up in the upper park on a closed road. And we have these strong down canyon winds every night. And so the fire at nighttime had burned down towards town. And so CAL FIRE showed up with a dozer, and they dozed in this line and caused a lot of resource damage. We have really shallow soils here in Bidwell Park and trails everywhere. And so they succeeded in stopping the fire here at this trail, but they also succeeded in keeping fire out of our burn units, which were pretty much intended to be burned in the summer. And also, these units, we would have liked to make them larger, but we had problems with not being able to burn from the top down. Basically, we didn't want to have to hold these units on steep slopes. So anyway, burn plans in place. Park director knows about them. City fire department, not so much. And CAL FIRE doesn't know anything about them. And so they come and they put in a dozer line, scar up the park, and keep fire out of areas that we want to burn for resource benefits. So definitely not a win. The big win for us was that if the fire had kept going, it would have bumped into this big burn we did. And so it helped people feel more comfortable that the fire wasn't going to come to town, that we'd done a bunch of burning. But another problem was that, because we've got this mapping of our star thistle, we can see that the dozer pretty much got into star thistle and dragged it all over along the edge of the fire. So we expect to see more star thistle coming in on that dozer line. So ideally, CAL FIRE, whoever's on duty, the park rangers, they all would have known about this, these burns that we had already planned, permitted, ready to go, approved by the park director. And they would have just either fired off the road, or they would have let the fire back down to the road. And we would have been able to tell a story of, hey, this wildfire actually accomplished some of the prescribed burning we wanted to get done, and was a good thing for the ecology here. Instead, we still have to burn these units, but now we also have new weeds spread through the park by these dozer lines. So that's kind of the first part of what data do you need to have? Well, we already had this data on weeds and management objectives and tactical kind of control lines, et cetera, related to this piece of land, but it didn't get communicated to the park people, didn't get communicated to the fire people. So I want to jump out of there real quick. Just in the bigger picture, this is the campfire that burned Paradise. Came real close to Chico, came right up to the edge of Bidwell Park. And so we've kind of got this awareness now in our community that doing things like burning tall grass in May, it can bias a level of regional protection. And so, our fire planning in the park is looking well beyond the park boundaries. So back to the fire plan. We're kind of in an extended planning process here in Chico with Bidwell Park, where we've worked on a kind of a master EIR for vegetation management. We've worked on a citywide burn plan. Now we're working on community wildfire protection plan for the city of Chico. So we've had a nice opportunity here to kind of integrate all that together, where during the process of building the EIR, we were able to work with local Native people and develop some kind of cultural burning objectives for them, get that into our city burn plan. And now we've actually had the Metupa tribe's been out doing some cultural burns for deer grass in our parks. So, we want to start off our planning efforts here with mapping the project with wildfire in mind, mapping those ecological values, looking at where we've got problems where we'd like to use fire, mapping our infrastructure at risk, and also mapping our infrastructure that is useful for controlling fire. So in Upper Park, we've got all these trails that on shallow soils are fairly wide, and they actually, if you went out there with a weed eater in the spring, it'd be just as effective as a dozer line in holding a fire. So in this process of assessing the property, we're trying to look at all the different ways that we expect fire to interact with the land, both what the threats are going to be and also the potential benefits. An important thing about this mapping to start is making sure that it's available in a format that's available for firefighters. So this is an example of a pre-attack fire plan we did for a private landowner. where we map the buildings on a piece of property. We use conventional kind of fire symbology for things like health spots, water sources. We map the hazards to firefighters. We map where the water sources are. Specific, we have information about what's in these fuel vaults and how wide the gates are. And then we put a QR code on there. And so the park people, in fire world, most of us are used to using QR codes to load maps directly into an app on our phones that we all use. And so by having, even if you just had this QR code on the mailbox at the entrance to your park with a sign for firefighters, you're packaging that information in a format that they're used to using. So in this case, these pre-attack maps are developed to be kind of to be folded like a normal map. They've got contact information. They've got kind of tactical considerations. They've got information on fuel breaks. But we're taking all this pre-fire information and putting it into a format that's accessible. So we want to have paper maps that we can give to our local firefighters. We want to have digital maps that we can give to incoming firefighters who may not be from the area, and we want to be able to give them give that same information to people, say with an incident command team that's coming into the area to manage a larger incident. So when it comes to kind of the non-map data, those cell phone numbers are really important, and also knowing who's on duty and when. Fire chiefs, a lot of our local chiefs, maybe they only work 2 days a week. So maybe you need to keep track of 3 battalion chiefs and a relief. You want to, and a lot of these people don't answer their cell phone when they're off duty. So being able to get in touch with a decision maker is really important. And also just understanding who's going to respond to your fire at what time. If it's the first fire in the area, maybe you're just going to get the local fire engine and the people from the station down the road. But if there's a lot going on, you might get people from LA County or Hollywood or Pasadena who've never been in your county. It's dark. They don't know anything about your property. So building your relationship with your locals right off the bat helps you get an idea of who's going to come when the call happens, and also helps you build these relationships. In general, CAL FIRE likes to drive their bulldozers all over the place right up against the fire, but it's not chiseled in stone that has to happen. There's places where people, like in Bidwell Park, the city chief attributes the dozer used to just a miscommunication. And the city here has expressed that they're willing to not use bulldozers in the park if we tell them where we don't want them to go. Which brings us back to kind of mapping, is that if there's been a bulldozer on your land in the past and carved up the landscape, you want that, and it's in a good place to hold a fire, then you want that information in the maps. Just so when they unload a bulldozer next time, they push the same ridge and don't go and make a new dozer line right next to one that's already there. When it comes to actual communication with the firefighters, one thing that we've been working on developing here for the city of Chico is a resource advisor program. And so when we go out on federal fires, there's resource advisors that work for the agencies who are trained, they're fire line qualified, and they're trained in resource management for either the Forest Service or the Park Service. Their job is to kind of keep the bulldozers out of the ARC sites, to keep the bulldozers from going through the fens full of rare plants, keep them out of the bogs and meadows. And it's kind of a tough assignment for most people, because you're kind of having to confront this really aggressive kind of suppression machine. Almost like put yourself out in front of the bulldozer, like you're in Tiananmen Square or something. But it's important to train your operational staff, your rangers, your interpreters, people that are already working for your park, in how to safely stay in an area during a fire. I think we often see pictures, we think that the flame draw is going to be huge and burning everything, and oftentimes the fire might burn on your property at night, backing down a hill with 2-foot flame lengths. And so a big part of having this resource advisor program is just training people how to operate safely in a fire environment. Ideally, you find people who've done that work before. But you need people who can be on site, be the face of your organization to represent your needs and your desires, to keep the bulldozers from tearing up your wet meadow or spreading weeds across the area that you just took weeds out of. And those people need to have the maps. They can be the people there with that information. And then the fifth thing that you need to think about before your land's on fire is just about hardening your assets. So identifying old wooden buildings, split rail fences, anything you have out there that might be damaged by a fire. So you can tell firefighters where your priorities are. Maybe you don't care about an old outbuilding. Maybe burning down an old barn is the best thing that could happen because you weren't able to tear it down because it's an ARC site, or something like. We've worked on projects where there's old dilapidated buildings that either you can't tear down because they're full of asbestos, or you can't tear down because they're on historic register, but there's people squatting in them and you want them to go away. So maybe you want that to burn down during a fire. So that's all part of kind of identifying your infrastructure, hardening the ones you want to keep. And when I say hardening your ecological assets, that also means like, hey, let's concentrate on removing star thistle along this road because it's going to be a bulldozer line during a fire. So, engaging some fire planners on your property, that's when we talk about mapping the property with wildfire in mind, is that there's likely places that they're going to try to put a dozer line if there's a fire coming. And it's really good to look at specific scenarios and say, okay, well, let's plan for a scenario where the fire starts on Highway 101 and burns up and over the ridge. Let's plan on a lightning scenario where the fire burns down the mountain. Each one of those is going to have a different management response. And so tailoring your land management around these potential scenarios is great. Just maybe you can avoid having star thistle in the patch between where they're going to unload the dozer and where they're going to go up the ridge. Another thing about hardening your assets is that you should always anticipate fire. So, in Butte County, we had a public works director that thought he was saving the county a lot of money by putting in plastic culverts everywhere. And then after the Camp Fire, they had to spend, millions of dollars replacing all these plastic culverts that burned. And so since we're in California, we should anticipate that we're going to have fire everywhere. And if we can do things like not use synthetic geotextiles for erosion control, then we're not going to melt that stuff and make a big mess when it burns. Or we can actually burn that land for star thistle control and not be melting a bunch of plastic. So those are the 5 key points I wanted to cover. And I wanted to show a couple maps from some previous work we've done. Time flies, so this was actually 19 years ago, but I don't use that font anymore. But when I talk about developing management compartments, this is Dye Creek Preserve, managed by the Nature Conservancy. Nature Conservancy has hundreds of thousands of acres under ecological management in the Alaskan foothills, which is an area that traditionally has had a lot of big fires. And so they had burn units here for rangeland improvement, for star thistle. We broke the landscape into kind of geographic chunks that shared common attributes. And then we developed prescriptions or recommendations for each compartment, kind of with progressively finer detailed mapping. So here's a map of what we call the power lines unit that is looking at fuel conditions, access conditions. One thing that came out of this work was that we decided we wouldn't really ever be able to burn this just because of the scale, but that it would surely burn in a wildfire. And it happens to be that this watershed divide here is like a place that firefighters have gone over and over for the last 30 years. Every time there's a fire, they bulldoze this. So in this case, we're looking at like, well, how can you get them to back off? Because if we can burn this during wildfire, it's the best case scenario. But then second best scenario is, hey, we're not going to keep them from trying to put the fire out there, but after they come and bulldoze this whole ridge and the fire's all out here, let's be positioned to burn this unit that winter because we'll have black all the way around it. So that's where taking this kind of landscape scale approach can pay some dividends. Like in Upper Bidwell Park, we'd really like to do some burning in some black oak up there that's got a lot of chaparral kind of up above it, up against the road. And it's tactically going to be really difficult for us to prescribe burn it. But we know that Highway 32 is an important kind of regional corridor for fire control, and that we're surely going to have a fire that burns the other side of the road on Highway 32 in the next, say, 5 to 10 years. So our plan now is like, okay, we've got it all together. We got the burn plan. Let's wait until we have a wildfire on Highway 32 that blackens that whole other side of the road. Then it'll be really easy for us to burn. So these are things that we just want to think about before the fire. Oh, there's a lot we can anticipate. It's California, so we can anticipate we're going to have a lot of fire on the ground. So one of the best things we can do on our managed landscapes is we know that they're probably going to come in with bulldozers and put dozer line around the houses at the edge of the wildland. But maybe that creates an opportunity for us to burn after the fire. So planning with fire in mind and knowing that there's going to be opportunities in conjunction with wildfire coming, maybe even, you know, in a few weeks after the fire. Anyway, I think that's kind of covers what I want to start with. What I was talking about there with Highway 32 is we've got had some fires here, and we'd like to do some cleanup burns in these areas where there's a lot of dead and down following these fires. Because of the brush up here, it's not really safe for us to do a hot burn here during the time of year that will actually meet our objectives with fire. But we know that there's going to be a fire that burns the other side of this road. You know, the campfire would have burned Highway 32 if the winds hadn't stopped. So we're just going to wait until that happens. Once this is all black, then we're going to have an opportunity here to burn this with pretty much zero chance of losing it into the heavy fuels. Anyway, I think ready to take some questions if you guys are done with that.
Zeke, thank you very much. Yeah, let's go right into questions. I am interested to hear your experience. So much great stuff, especially focused toward kind of single preserve or single management organization planning. Maybe before we take questions, maybe you can tell us your experience working with a couple of different organizations, maybe where multiple, preserves abut each other, but they're managed by different organizations. Have you helped different organizations sort of come together over planning?
That's kind of happening here in Upper Bidwell Park. So we have city lands, we have BLM lands, so we have CSU Chico lands, and then they go into lands owned by the guy that owns Sierra Nevada Brewing Company. And so the reserve has been doing a lot of cross-boundary planning. And we've been able to burn on the brewery guys' property, on the city, and on the reserve. And that's being done through the local RCD. The RCD got a grant to do CEQA on that cross-boundary chunk. So it's kind of the Butte County Foothills Forest Health Plan. And so they've been able to assemble those 3 different landowners into one kind of planning unit. What we did for them was we used LiDAR to map their fuels and do some fire modeling. And then we laid out burn units on the property owned by the Sierra Nevada Brewing Company guy. And then used the LiDAR to model the potential fire behavior changes. And then that helped them get a grant, and we were able to do the burn.
What would you say was the single most important ingredient to bringing those folks together and having a shared plan?
I think bringing in an outside group like the RCD that wasn't just focused specifically on their land.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, I know folks have questions, so please go ahead and just take yourselves off mute and fire away.
Okay, I'll take that invitation. So Zeke, I saw your long interview and discussion with Daniel Swain. That was really, really good. But everything you were saying about bulldozer lines has hit us really hard in South San Jose, where we have serpentine grassland.
There's the bike. There's the bike. Yeah.
And so they come and they cut bulldozer lines, and we have weed problems, and they'll even cut the bulldozer lines after the fire is out, because they have this rule that, this is what I heard, that they can't say it's contained unless they have a bulldozer line around it. And we've tried, this we is like a large group of people, the Open Space Authority and other resource managers have, really tried to say, can't you just let it burn up to that nice ridgetop road? And they're like, no, we're just going to do what we want. And, it's like a low biomass system, and the fire is actually ecologically good for it. But we've never been able to kind of get a protocol that would allow, let it burn up to a, existing barrier, and don't put in the bulldozer lines. It's just over and over again. It's happened like 3 times in the past few years.
Really a universal problem with the dozers. And the places where I've seen it work, it's really difficult in places with mixed ownership where you've got homes right up against 3 different conservation properties. I think we stand to make some progress here in Chico just because the ridge top's already got a dozer line. It was probably put in 100 years ago. And now it's just like perma dozer line. There's no soil on it. And so it's really site specific. I saw Sasha had a comment, and I in the chat, I'm not sure what it says. Okay, I'll get to Sasha's comment in a minute. Yeah, it's tough with dozers, but a big part of it's relationships and building comfort with the people. You might not get it done in a really urban landscape. I've seen it work on bigger preserves, with Nature Conservancy, and places where you've got a relationship, a long-term relationship with the local fire managers. It's tough in an area where you've got, in general, I think a big problem with CAL FIRE too is that we've got this kind of treadmill. People retire at 50 and they move through the battalion chief position quickly, and so it's part of CAL FIRE's culture that we have this huge turnover in our leadership at the unit level, and it's really hard to build those long-term relationships.
Zeke, there's kind of a two-parter. Kristen and Sasha. Kristen's question kicks it off. Has anyone utilized a resource advisor program to successfully limit dozer lines during a major incident? And Sasha followed in her experience, CAL FIRE doesn't use resource advisor programs on non-federal incidences.
Right. I think that doesn't mean that you can't put one of your people out there in that role. It just means that they're not going to order resource advisors as part of the incident command, but that you still have a leeway as a landowner to have your representative. And if your representative is someone who can be in the field as operations are happening, they can be a lot more impactful than if they're sitting in the ICP.
Yeah, that's been my experience, that to some extent, for sure, if you have someone who's fire line trained in your organization and can be out there on the ground during the incident, you can have some sway. They're not necessarily going to listen to you, but you have a much better chance than if you're not out there on the land directing where things can and can't happen.
Yeah,
or trying to.
I think it's so important to, maybe Sasha could speak to her experience. There's the initial attack kind of fire that's like one fire starts on a windy day and it blows on your property. And then there's the kind of blind country fires of 2017, where there's so many fires going on that things are kind of just a fog of war, but also that you've got days and days of fire burning with low severity slowly, and that buys some decision space. And so you're going to have different options during a major fire campaign than you are on an initial attack fire.
Hey, Zeke, I've heard fire professionals in Sonoma County say that historically our fire return interval was 40, 50, 60 years. Now it seems to be 1 or 2 or 3. Are you seeing something like that across the entire state?
Yeah, well, the climate effects are extreme, and we're just in such a deep drought that we've got large swaths of land in the foothills here that look like they burned last year that didn't. The trees are dying because they're so stressed. So yeah, I think a lot of our kind of prior planning and modeling and everything's based on a climate that no longer exists.
Can I add to that, Zeke?
Yeah.
We also have people causing ignitions all over the place and an accumulation of fuels from lack of stewardship. So like there are many things contributing to increased catastrophic fires happening all
Yeah, including invasive grasses that carry fire in ways that native grasses didn't.
Great question, Tom. Other questions from the group?
I'd like to ask Sasha to talk a little about like your experience in 2017 when you when you had fire burning on your preserve, and like your interactions with the firefighters and what you wish you would have had done before that.
Yeah, I think I was maybe less impacted than, yeah, I see open space on here, I think, ag and open space, and, definitely regional parks, where dozers were being pushed on those properties. Our property literally had no one on it. So it was just me and then eventually a neighbor out there trying to put out hotspots and make our way around. But I never during those fires interacted with anyone. More on the wall bridge, I led a crew on that incident. So I was interacting directly with resources on the wall bridge. And yeah, there was an area where they couldn't get dozers to it, out on the edge of the cedars. And it was about 5 miles long and on insanely steep terrain, like puts the Klamath to shame. And they wanted to have crews dig hand line across the 5 miles of extremely up and down slope terrain on fire that was dead out and had, no fuels whatsoever on the other side because it's bare mineral soil and nothing can grow on it across that 5 miles. So yeah, I mean, even that part, I was like, you're putting lives at risk at this point for a fire that's completely out because you want to dig hand line on insanely steep slopes and slick ground for 5 miles in the middle of nowhere.
One thing I'm encouraged by is that the state's kind of wildfire, I don't remember the acronym, but there's the latest plan of how we're going to deal with fire and climate change. They address altering suppression tactics, modifying suppression tactics to allow more leeway for CAL FIRE to use fire. Right now, it's kind of basically illegal for CAL FIRE to manage fire. And so nobody really wants to take that responsibility. If you can put a fire out at an acre and you got a land manager saying, oh, why don't you let it burn for 10? They're not going to do that unless there's a big fire going on and no one else really knows what's happening. But there's encouraging things happening on that front. And I think a big part of us kind of preparing for that to happen is making it happen ourselves. One thing that is to CAL FIRE's benefit, even though it's maddening for us to kind of try to implement, say, prescribed fire policy with them, is that they still give a lot of leeway to the region chief or the unit chiefs. And so even though it's this really super kind of hierarchical organization, the unit chiefs have a lot of flexibility in how they implement things. And so that is a positive. And it just goes back to that importance of really building those relationships and really building a campaign. If you don't want dozers to be used every time there's a fire on a specific ground, it's like, well, can we do a prescribed burn here? Can we build support for kind of a regional scale fire break? Like, what can we do to advance, to make it happen ourselves, kind of create the reality that we want to see, not wait for CAL FIRE to suddenly become a bunch of ecologists, because that's not going to happen.
Work that's being done in Marin County as part of the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority is kind of testing the waters for that kind of countywide, that kind of coordination, Zeke, at a countywide level, and just what kind of permissions and permitting is involved with something like that. So we'll have to watch what goes on in Marin carefully. Another aspect of sort of during an incident is sort of using information to help the effort. And we've been talking a lot about getting kind of your data ducks in a row so that you have that information ready when the dozers are coming, or the suppression effort is at your doorstep. Allison Schichtel at Ag and Open Space here in Sonoma County, because Ag and Open Space is sort of part of the county, was sort of in some ways not conscripted, but was asked to be a part of the county's sort of GIS and data central hub. And I'm curious, Allison, what you can share with us about that experience, and what you felt was really great about that experience, and how you were maybe use some information that Ag and Open Space had on hand in order to help the effort.
Sure, I'm reflecting on what the experience was like in 2017 and then how different it was in 2020. And so in 2017, we were really sort of building county GIS for fire response. There was, no evacuation that was planned or anticipated. And so that looked very different, but probably more speaking to 2020 and how we operate as this really pretty fine-tuned machine. The primary role of county staff GIS is focused on planning for evacuation and learning from CAL FIRE and folks on the ground where they're expecting the fire to be moving. So we're really looking to fire officials to make those calls to activate evacuation zones and notify the community and get them out during a fire event. But maybe more to this topic, thinking about the role during an event, but also after the fact, participating in a watershed task force to, after the fact, evaluate impacts from dozer lines on sensitive natural resources, to map those dozer lines, make corrections to the data that CAL FIRE have generated, and get those out to land managers so that they can start restoring their lands and assessing impacts. And then also looking at, burn severity, vegetation community impacts, and anticipating where there may be need for erosion funding and folks on the land to address those impacts. So it's really interesting to hear this, what we wish we had planned for in advance of an event, and having mapped those resources, and being a person in the room who can provide that information to the emergency operations managers as information that's served up on one of the web maps for incident command. So I've got wheels turning on how, from an EOC perspective, we can start integrating some of this information.
Yeah, it's a good point about the EOC connection. It's just that each county does it a little differently, but being able to have this information available widely to other decision makers is really important. And there hasn't been a standard kind of template for that, or even when we're working on fires, doing the mapping live, it's really random. Someone might just come in with a flash drive and be like, hey, here's a map of our, whatever, park and preserve picnic tables. And we haven't done a great job of getting ahead of that and building a conduit for that from, it's just like all the other agencies in the state. Like, we've got 58 counties and we've got 52 different GIS systems that don't talk to each other. So I think what you guys are doing here is building this kind of regional cooperative is really a great step towards solving some of those issues.
Well, on that note, Zeke, I want to, on behalf of the group, I want to thank you so much for coming and sharing your expertise and your thoughts and your top 5. And I also want to thank Allison for teeing up next month's topic so well, about what to do immediately after a fire, in terms of restoring and healing immediately after a fire. So please come to the next meeting where we'll have a speaker about that. Thank you all so much. Annie,